Hey, I've got some more worms for you. Aren't you excited? This one is 12-6, which are the Annelids, or otherwise known as phylum Annelida. So if you just stick an A on the end of that one, that's your phylum. Alright, so what is an annelid? All the worms that are found in this phylum are called segmented worms, because when you look at them, you can see little divisions of their body. The word Annellus is where annelids got their name from. Annellus in Latin means little rings, so you can kind of get where that comes from. The little rings in their bodies cause little like segments inside, little compartments separated by these walls. These little walls are called septa. Sometimes you'll see it septum, T-U-M, like that, and that's the same thing. Septa is just plural. So inside of annelids, we find that their body is divided into little segments, and each one divided by a septa, or a little wall between the segments. Each segment on a worm may or may not carry a couple of different things, such as eyes. Earthworms don't really have eyes, other ones do. They may have little antennae sticking out, or they may have little sensory organs like bristles that stick out. So depending on the type of annelid we're looking at, we'll see lots of these different things. A lot of them will have something called setae, or AE is I, setae would actually be the correct way to say it, setae, and these are little bristles that help in movement. Now earthworms, it's really hard to see them, but you can feel them. So on every little segment, he's got two little hairs sticking on either side of the body, so 4 hairs per segment. And so if you get your finger wet and run it up and down the length of an earthworm's body, when would you do that? You would feel these little bristles. On marine worms, these bristles are just like huge and crazy, and so they look like little furry caterpillars. Now what makes them more advanced than the previous worms is that they have a true coelom. They have an actual body cavity lined with a mesoderm, which is what makes it a body cavity. Alright, let's take a look. Here are the septa I was talking about. So let me get a little brighter color here. So this is a cross-section of an earthworm. So each of these little walls, that's a septa. And so each of these is a segment. And so each little rectangle here is a segment. Here's a skin on the outside, and there's a muscle right there. Here is a different way of looking at a worm. If you were to chop his head off and look straight down inside of him, this yellow right here, that is his coelom. That is his body cavity. So we have an intestine, we have organs, and then all this is space inside, which is hollow. So that's his true coelom. Alright, how do worms eat? Well, depending on the type of worm, some of them are filter feeders, like the ones in the ocean. Some of them are predators, like mudworms and sandworms. And then we have like our earthworms, which go around eating dirt, but digesting the little microscopic organisms in there. A lot of them will extend their pharynx, which is normally, tucked inside. Imagine him like that. The pharynx is normally tucked inside, but they can make it pop out and then pump food into their esophagus and then put the pharynx back in when they're done. Once the food gets inside, so if here's his mouth, once it gets inside, so we have a pharynx, and then it goes esophagus, and then it kind of bubbles out like this. That is the crop, and just like in birds, the crop is where food is stored. From there, then it's going to move on to the gizzard, and the gizzard is where food is ground up. Then the rest of it is all intestines. So P-E-C-G-I is kind of how you can remember the order. Pecgi. So it goes pharynx, esophagus, crop, gizzard, and then intestines. So here's a little earthworm inside, and so here's his little mouth. His mouth is right there, little mouth cavity. So here's that pharynx. And then from there, it kind of bubbles out. So that's his esophagus right there. And then the next thing is a crop. So there's the crop right there, the gizzard right there, and then the intestines would go from there. Same thing on this picture here. Here's the mouth. There's the pharynx, is pretty small, esophagus, and then it bubbles out to the crop. Can't really see the gizzard, and then it would go intestine all the rest of the way. How do they circulate? Well, we've actually got a real circulatory system now. They have what's called a closed circulatory system, which means that all their blood stays inside of their blood vessels. Nobody else has had blood vessels yet, so they actually have blood vessels. That's kind of cool. They have two major blood vessels that go down the length of the worm. And so if here's, well, I'm putting eyes on him to show his head. What happens here is that the blood, there's a dorsal one that flows from his butt towards his head, and then it does a U-turn, and then he has a ventral one which goes back towards his butt and then does another U-turn. So basically it's just a big loop or circle, and the blood just goes around and around and around. But he does have what looks like bridges near the front, and those are his little hearts. And those little hearts help to beat and keep the blood flowing around his body. So, and then down the length, there's also some other vessels that connect the dorsal and the ventral blood vessels. For breathing, depending on, again, which type of annelid we have, if they live in the water, they just use gills to filter oxygen out of the water. But the land ones, they live in moist environments, so they just work on diffusion through their skin. So here's another little earthworm showing how thin his skin is, showing that he can diffuse quite nicely. For excretion, since they have an anus, they're going to use it to poo, but any cellular waste are going to be eliminated by something called nephridia. Nephridia are kind of like mini kidneys, and so they help to excrete urine out of him. And every single segment of the worm's body has two little nephridia in there, so he has lots and lots of kidneys. For the response system, they do have a brain and nerve cords. And so that's kind of like our brain and spinal cord. They also have some things like sensory tentacles, so they can feel, kind of like whiskers on a cat. They have chemical receptors, so they can almost taste. They have statocysts, if you remember, those detect gravity. So if you're underground in a tunnel, it's good to know which way is up. And they have teeny tiny little bitty eyeballs on some of them. For movement, they have two types of muscles, kind of like I showed you on the last set of worms. They have circular ones that go around his body this way, and longitudinal ones which go back and forth. Now the circular ones, when they contract and get smaller, it makes the worm get longer. But if the long muscles contract, it actually pulls the ends in and makes the worm shorter. Some worms, to help them move, have little paddles sticking out of their side on both sides, and those little paddles are like oars of a boat, called Parapodia. Parapodia, there with the light. Parapodia are little paddles that help them to crawl and swim. Earthworms don't have these, marine worms do. For reproduction, most of them do sexual reproduction. No, you cannot chop off the head of a worm and expect it to grow back. It doesn't work on earthworms. If you chop it in half, it's dead. They use external fertilization, which means the male and female don't really connect bits. They just kind of, here you go, and they give the sperm over, and then the female takes it and does what she wants with it. Most of them are, some have separate sexes, so meaning they could be a boy or a girl, and some are hermaphrodites, which means they can be both a boy and a girl. But a worm cannot fertilize itself. It needs another worm in order to fertilize. What happens during worm sex is kind of weird and creepy. Two worms will head towards each other with their heads going in opposite directions. And you guys know how worms have turtlenecks, right? A little turtleneck like that. It's called a clitellum. A clitellum, their little turtleneck, is a little storage container. So what will happen is two worms will crawl under each other's clitellum and give each other sperm. The clitellum will hang on to the sperm, fertilize the eggs, and then becomes a little cocoon, because the clitellum will eventually slip off of the worm and then forms a cocoon with all the little babies inside. And then out pop little baby worms. It's kind of cute. Oh, worm sex. Oh no. So here's a picture. So here's the head of one, the head of the other, the clitellum, and they kind of line up with each other. And then the sperm will be passed on to the other one, and then the clitellum will make a little cocoon. So here you can see one clitellum with sperm, here's the other clitellum with sperm. Yeah, so they both get pregnant at the same time. Kind of interesting. Okay, we have different types of groups. Remember, they're all kingdom Animalia. Phylum Annelida. Oh, there goes my light. And so what's after phylum is class. So this, I have groups. It should really say class. So this is the first class, Oligochaeta. So the first part is easy, oligo, and then the CHAE, key, just like a key, chaeta, Oligochaeta, which means many segments, and these are earthworms and their relatives. These guys can live in freshwater and soil. They have very few setae, which are the little bristles, and they have very streamlined bodies. So when we think of worms, it's this group. So oligochaetes are the first class of earthworms that we typically think of. Then we have Hirudinea. Hirudinea. These are leeches. These are parasites. They're all leeches are parasitic. They suck the blood and body fluids of their host. Some are carnivorous, and they'll eat small snails, worms, and larvae of other things. They have two suckers, one on each end. So here's a little mouth. So they'll have a sucker here and a sucker here to make sure that they can hang on super tight and don't let go. Their mouth has 3 teeth inside that they use to cut into their host. And then they release an anticoagulant, which prevents your blood from clotting up, and an anesthetic, which prevents you from feeling it. Although Mr. Moon tried this last year, and he says, yes, you do feel it quite nicely. So here's some leeches. You can see a sucker right there, and his mouth will be right in the middle. And then you can see the segments on there, like that. So he's a fat, full one. He is full of blood. He's happy. And the last class is Polychaeta. Polychaetes are things like sandworms, bloodworms, and their relatives, which you probably never noticed before, so I'll show you a picture. These are marine annelids. They have the paddle-like appendages called Parapodia, and they have lots of setae to make them super hairy, and they look like little hairy caterpillars. So they typically live in the mud, vertically, with their mouth usually just kind of right here, but they'll reach out and use little bristles to smell or taste, and then some of them have these gnarly claw-like structures that they'll bite you. So here's the underside of one, showing a mouth. These are his lips. These are little sensory antennae right here, and his little spikes, his little setae, are venomous, and so you don't want to mess with that dude because he's pretty nasty. Mike Rowe did a Dirty Jobs episode where he went out hunting these guys, and pretty entertaining. And I know you're thinking, oh, we should watch that. Well, maybe we'll watch a clip. We'll see. All right, so those are oligochaetes and annelids. So kingdom, Animalia, phylum, Annelida, and then we got the 3 classes, Oligochaeta, Polychaeta, and Hirudinea. And that's all on your paper that I gave you at the beginning of the last chapter. All right, there you go. Segmented worms for you. See you tomorrow. Bye.